Look, I'm going to try and keep your attention, obviously. Attention is a really massive topic right now, and I'm sure you're all aware of its presence, heard about what it does and what it doesn't do and the problem it's solving. But today is a little bit different, so I'm planning to not so much talk to you about what we've done from an attention measurement perspective, but talk to you about where it's going. So let's talk about where the ecosystem is going and some of the amazing advancements in attention science that will change the future of this ecosystem and make sure that, you know, transparency and stability and value becomes part of the next phase of attention economics. But before we do, I think what I might just do is give you a deeper understanding of the problem we're solving for. I'm not going to try and rehash some stuff, but I do have some new stuff. If anyone sort of read some of the press that went viral in the recent weeks, you know, Professor Byron Sharp was quite vocal about his, you know, position on the true north of reach planning. I had my PhD at Ehrenberg Bass, so I'm all into the concept of reach planning. But, you know, as a true north measure, and I agree that it's a basic premise to brain growth, but the reality is the basics are broken. So true north measures work if they remain stable, but in this case it hasn't. And the error below reach is what I want to talk to you about, because it's a bit of a mic drop moment to understand what we're actually dealing with here. So we talk about it in terms of attention volume. Let me just explain. If reach-based planning worked, each impression that you buy by the time in view that you buy against would actually have humans watching at full capacity at every second, right? So if you think about the concept of the potential of bi-seconds and how many impressions, this is 100% of reach volume, which is fantastic for reach planning because you know what you're getting, you know what you're paying for. And the concept is that humans watch every second that you buy and you pay for. But this is more of a reality. This is, the fact is you don't get 100% attention volume. And in this case, this is actually I think this is a premium video platform. You're getting about 44% of the reach volume that you think you are buying. So of the capacity, 44% of the time humans are actually watching, and that's a good effort. And then you get this sort of distribution. So it does change by platform and format. So in this case, 20% attention volume. So if you think about reach-based planning, you know, you're thinking about equitable impressions across different platforms and different formats. But the volume that sits behind it, if you think about the way that people view and the distribution of decay, the reality is very different. So which is my point about reach-based planning, that it's all good and well to say that it's the true north, but what sits below it is actually changed. And what this does is it makes it very complicated to normalise error because every platform and every format within every platform has a different distribution of this volume, right? So it's not just as simple as going, no worries, we'll work out how much attention's paid generally and how humans interact with media, and we'll just sort of add an average or add sort of a simple unit. But it doesn't work that way. Each recipe that sits underneath or each distribution is very, very different, and it's a bit stressful. And this happens because of this. This is actually how humans watch, right? So we don't sort of sit there and have concentrated awareness to one particular ad. We switch constantly in and out of, you know, looking at the ad, then reading something on the screen, then talking to your family, then going back and looking at the screen again, then looking at the ad. So we have this constant state of switching. But the reality is time in view doesn't account for human behaviour, right? So there are gaps in, you know, actually looking at an ad to time in view as the clock is ticking. And this is, mark my words, the absolute root cause of our problem. So when we made a decision to change from human measurement to time-based measurement using metadata, this is absolutely point of modern measurement failure. Now, I just happened to pull about 60,000 ads to demonstrate this point. But what you can see is in a critical 10 seconds of time, only about 30% of the change in time in view is accounted for with human attention. I mean, that's, you know, 2/3 of your views that don't have human attention attached to it. And that changes, again, that distribution and that relationship changes across all the different platforms and formats. And this is why, you've probably heard us talk about this before, this is why viewability measurement critically underperforms. It's not that the MRC was wrong, because they weren't. They brought in a standard at a time when the internet was very unregulated and unruly. And they brought in a measurement to say, hey, if an ad's not on screen for at least 2 seconds of time and at 50% pixels, then it can't be considered, saleable, or you can't pay for that. But the reality is, again, they're basing it on this premise of time in view, which has very little of a relationship with attention. So what we know with viewability events is that about 75% of the time against the currency that you trust, which is viewability, gets no human attention, which relates to what I was saying before about time in view. And it's also why the ability for a brand to be noticed is getting harder and harder. I heard Sir John Hegarty earlier talk about creative and the importance of creative, but this is the reality of what's happening. So if you leave your brand to second 19 in this distribution, 5% of this attention volume, or 5% of the people that you've kind of gone out to pitch to or sell to are seeing the actual brand. And there's massive misattribution from, because branding is so critical to taking, a human to the next level of engagement, say whether it's a click or whether it's an actual sale or consideration or whatever it is. So this is a real problem. I just heard a conversation about budgeting, and while I'm all in about spending more in times of crisis, how do you know if you spend more that you're actually going to get more eyeballs? So I don't know if anyone saw my piece from the Cannes Festival this year with Peter Field, but he's just recently reported that the share of voice, share of market relationship has significantly failed. And what's interesting is that the time it started to fail was at the time we started to measure time in view. So what we know now is that share of voice, share of market's anyone's guess, because you might be spending $1 million, your competitor might be spending $1 million, but the reality is you're spending it on platforms where that attention volume is lower than your competitor, and yet you're spending the same dollars. So the relationship for budgeting and spend is just not there anymore. I also say that's why attention proxies that use time in view as a baseline, I call an ill-fitting Band-Aid. Don't know why I call it that, but, I call it that. So this is the point everything changed, and I sort of alluded to it earlier. Everything changed the day we started to stop measuring outward and we started measuring inward. We used to measure human behaviour, then we decided it's the internet, we can scale, let's pick metadata because it's scalable and it makes an assumption about human behaviour. The reality is it's so grossly not correct, and this is the problem. So it all started when we stopped measuring outward and we started measuring inward. And if you think about that, that actually makes complete sense. So I know it's a bit of a negative conversation, but today it's kind of a dice roll. If you don't understand what sits underneath in terms of that distribution, it's a bit of a dice roll when you spend more money. This is doing it the other way. So human data can actually predict time in view, but time in view can't predict human attention. So when you actually reverse it out and you use outward-facing data or human attention data to predict time in view, everything changes. The relationship becomes much, much stronger. So what I often say is that, if you're thinking about attention as a measure, make sure that you think about both, right? So tools based on scaled metadata, that's important, but trained by human attention data are the future of our industry. These are the things that can truly equalise this error and make reach great again. Oh, very funny. I don't know why I wrote that. So both. So pick tools that do both, because I get that panels are not scalable, but certainly metadata is so badly incorrect. You need a combination. Right. So that's the problem we're solving for. So what exactly is attention science and how does this solve the problem? So what's exciting about what we've done, I've been doing this for 5 years, is we're starting to see pretty excitable patterns, right? So we collect across about 12 countries, 4 different platforms and formats and devices, more platforms, but we do mobile, PC, TV, cinema now, outdoor. And what attention science is when you start to see replicable norms across multiple sets of data. So rather than seeing an attention pattern here and one relates to the other and there's correlations, you start to see generalizability. And when patterns are generalizable, they're predictable, they're meaningful, they're reliable. You can rely on them versus just chance. So I'm asking to sort of, the future is about attention science, where patterns and mathematics can actually forge the attention economy further. And in my personal opinion, I've spoken at the WFA before about currency versus attention signals. For me, this is the key to stability, value, and longevity in an economy that's coming. So I'm going to take you through some. This is heavy. Attention elasticity. I'm going to take you through the patterns so that you can kind of understand what I mean. So we found this thing called attention elasticity. And elasticity is the range of seconds possible under the conditions of the platform. What that means is that, different platforms give us the same range or attention elasticity across all different countries and all different boundary conditions. What that means is that, lower performing platforms, the best your ad could perform is probably 3 seconds with a slight deviation, standard deviation, whereas higher performing platforms and more quality platforms, there's a large range. So we see these elasticities, if you like, across all different formats and platforms, and that's exciting because that means we know what to expect in terms of how much attention your creative can gain. And creative is tempered by this, so don't be thinking that you can build an amazing amazing ad that's Cannes Lion Award winner and expect it to fall outside of these norms. It doesn't work that way because the functionality of the platform is largely what drives this. It's the user experience. Classic example, we were looking at outdoor media yesterday, some of the data, we've just built the model for it. And interestingly, people pay less attention to outdoor when it's raining. And you know why? Because they sit there, trying to rush through and that's, I know, not the same, but it's the functionality of that experience with that platform that drives that attention. So it's the same with high scrollable versus non-scrollable, etc. What's also happening is we're starting to move away from purely attention time and moving to attention shapes. What I mean by that is we see systematic viewing clusters of humans that sit under these averages, right? So a classic example, you could get 3 seconds on one platform and 3 seconds on another, but the outcomes are slightly different. And that's because you might pay concentrated 3 seconds, whereas you might kind of switch a lot more, but the averages are the same. So these viewing behaviours are more about how people are viewing, less about how long they're viewing. Then we talked about attention volume already, so we know that there are systematic volumes or decay curves, if you like, by platform and format. This is huge because when you start to include decay curves, attention decay curves in media planning, you can then overlay them with reach planning and you can optimise for that. So you can, as I said, equalise the error that sits underneath it. This is fun. The other thing we're seeing, I'm not sure if you're aware of double jeopardy pattern, but double jeopardy is basically when a brand is hit twice, so it's a double negative. And in the original Andrew Ehrenberg papers, it was small brands are hit twice in that they have fewer people who buy them, less often, so it's a double hit. And we're starting to see that in this data, which is exciting. So low attention formats or platforms have more people who switch more often. Right? Smaller attention platforms have smaller elastic limits, so the creative is hit harder. I know we'll probably chat about creative after, but creative suffers in our ecosystem now because you can't move outside of these norms. It's not the fault of creative. Low attention platforms have a wider attention viewability gap. So, you think you're buying, I talked about an average of 75% of viewability based impressions don't have attention, but it's worse for other lower attention platforms, right? And the biggie is that lower attention platforms drive less mental availability for you and more for your competitor. So it's easier for your brand to be misattributed on low attention platforms. Classic case in point was what I said before. If your brand's not even up front, of course it's going to be, particularly if you're a challenger brand, someone's going to think of your bigger competitor. So we're starting to see these patterns. And this is the last one. So we're starting to really see quite consistently that there is an order of attention in that platform plays the biggest role. Format, context, demographic, and creative is last. A lot of people don't like to hear that, but it's absolutely based on the fact that it can't push against these user experiences with these formats. So what? So attention science is the concept that these patterns are predictable and they can be used mathematically to power signals for media planning and buying, and that's what's going to happen. So we're moving away from attention concepts, which is, we found a correlation between this and this, and isn't this wonderful, to how about we use some proper mathematics and sit underneath, media planning, media buying, and verification for a robust sort of future. And what I wanted to say was this is super important because I am a big believer that it's not going to be a currency anytime soon. I'm a believer that reach is here to stay. But I also think while reach is the dominant currency and it drives CPMs, we need to make sure that we normalise or equalise this error. So for me, it's the key to longevity, stability and value. Human data does tell a different story, absolutely, than metadata. Good enough is where we've come from, right? So I know more than anyone that attention needs to be stable and valuable and, bring rigour to the future. So good enough is where we come from. So I personally invested in making sure that it's not just a proxy measure that does sort of half a job, that it's really, really good value and solid and rigorous. Definitely understand the flow-on effects because inequitable impressions impacts more than you think. It's not just reach-based planning. Ask your agency to test attention science. The last thing I'll say is remember procurement holds the cards, right? So at the end of the day, procurement, their job is cost reduction. So at the moment, there's a bit of a disconnect between change for something like this and procurement because they don't want to pay more per impression, even though you probably triple your impact and efficiency, or effectiveness, I should say. So it's a bit of a false economy. So I say bring procurement along for the ride.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Should we start making blue hats with "Make Reach Great Again" on them?
Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed.
Is this where we're going? I mean,
I should have looked at that on the plane.
I oscillate between being terrified about we've been doing in the past, right, and super excited. I mean, the reality is we've spent so long focused on measures which have decades of time behind them. And yet I think you're starting to unearth a lot of insights that are answering questions that we always had in our minds but couldn't articulate in a scientific way. And so I guess what's exciting for me is potentially we're moving past why is attention important into how do I make, as a marketer or a brand, attention work for me.
100%.
And you've got these patterns, which I think are brilliant, but maybe, I'm a media person, so of course I move into the operational aspects of these things. How do I take some of these patterns as a brand and start to act on them, make them part of the way I plan my media, activate my marketing campaigns? And you listed a lot of patterns there. Maybe you could pick one or two which you think are the first ports of call that a brand can take.
Yeah, I mean, you have to find an attention vendor that has product that has something like this incorporated. But a classic for me is the viewing clusters. Without a doubt, the viewing clusters are the thing that changes the game because, like I said, if you just use time-based metrics, it doesn't account for how engaged and how distracted people are, and averages aren't always great. So I think that the viewing clusters is a big part of how we're actually building towards optimizing for outcomes. And then the second piece of that, without a doubt, is the volume. So, there are tools at the moment, including our own, that are being built so that you can upload your own media plan, use your own reach curves, and then apply these attention curves to sort of understand the difference and build scenarios. So, I don't think it's an easy, you just have to talk to an attention provider about that.
Do you think there's going to be a set of norms around attention where standard reach-based approaches, which we've used historically to define the performance of media activity, can be adapted or modified to really start to get I don't want to call it an effective reach, but something along those lines of, an attentive reach that gives us a better way to
Yeah, so
think about it.
I love that. The downside is the minute, like I said, that the platform functionality plays the biggest role in all of those things. So the minute you apply a norm, the math will stay the same, but the input variables change, because if one platform changes the way that they deliver and serve ads, the way that the human views is different. So there's always going to be needing a constant cycle of human data sort of normalizing or training these models that go into planning. But the concepts will hold. I'm sure of it.
I really appreciated the conversation around the concept that the creative can only do so much, and the platform really dictates how attentive people are. And I know the industry has long debated and discussed like why media and creative can't come together, why these are potentially disparate views, but it starts to bring us together, I feel like, about finding the realities of where the best creative can be displayed in a way that really does create an impact on a person viewing it. And I wonder if you can think about any sort of tips or approaches which marketers can start to think about as they think about platforms and creative and attention.
So interesting, my first book was on emotions and creative. So I'm all in on the creative space, right? So I do understand the value of creative two ways. From a more subjective, emotional way, without a doubt, you lean in, you listen, etc. And from a branding perspective, because don't forget creative, there's objective branding, which means that it's functional and it leads you to a sale. But I don't think you understand, in every set of data that we see, a piece of creative, because our technology has the capability of filming people while they're using, TikTok and YouTube and, Facebook and Insta and whatever, everything. But we're also a video player, so I can pull an ad out of your Facebook feed and replace it with a Calvin Klein or a Red Bull, and I can also pull it out of your TikTok feed and replace it with Red Bull and have a look at the difference. And what happens is that same ad on platform A performs better in terms, it might get 7 seconds, and then the next platform it's 5 seconds, and the next platform it's 3.5, the next platform it's 2.5, and the next platform it's 0.5, right? If creative was the driver of attention, it would be 7 seconds across all platforms, and it would never ever deviate. But that pattern is constant, regardless of whether it's good creative or bad creative. It's constant. There's always a decay. So I think creative hate me, because I have to reveal the truth. But the nature of the platforms are kind of constraining creativity, quite frankly.
Karen, thank you so much for your time, your brilliant insights.
Thank you.
I know I feel slightly smarter. I hope everyone else does as well. Thank you again.